So here's the thing. I, 37M, have always been there for my family, especially my niece. She's 13, and her mom, my sister-in-law, has had a rough go of it since my brother passed a few years back. I stepped in where I could, helped with expenses, made sure my niece didn't go without. I never thought twice about it, honestly. Family's family, right? Anyway, the day this all went down started like any other. I was heading home after a regular day at work, looking forward to putting my feet up and maybe watching some TV. But as soon as I walked through the door, I noticed something was off. My phone was ringing nonstop. I checked it and saw a few missed calls from my sister-in-law, and some messages too, though none of them made much sense. She just kept saying, "You need to pick up. It's serious," and "You're in trouble." No context? Nothing. Now, I'll admit, I brushed it off at first. I figured it was some drama with her finances or whatever. She'd been in and out of financial messes lately, and I'd had to bail her out before, so I ignored it. Figured I'd call her back later once I'd settled in. But then, maybe an hour later, I got another call, but this time it was from a blocked number. I answered, figuring it was some scam call, but then the person on the other end said, "Hello, is this my name? This is Detective so-and-so. We need you to come down to the station." That got my attention. I can't even explain the dread that crept up. It's that feeling where you know something's seriously wrong and you have no clue what it is, but your gut is just screaming at you. I asked what was going on, but they wouldn't tell me anything over the phone, just insisted I come down as soon as possible. So I grabbed my keys and went straight to the station, trying to mentally run through every possible reason I could be there. But I couldn't come up with anything that made sense. When I got there, they led me into one of those cold, sterile rooms with a metal table and chairs, and the whole atmosphere made me feel like I was in some bad crime show. The detective sat down across from me, looking dead serious, and asked if I knew why I was there. I said no, but by that point my mind was racing, trying to piece together what the hell was going on. Then he told me. He said my niece had come forward with some serious accusations against me. I didn't understand at first, just blinked at him, trying to process. But when he repeated himself and explained exactly what she was claiming, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. She was accusing me of something I wouldn't even repeat out loud, something that, honestly, made my skin crawl just hearing it. I was stunned, completely frozen in shock. My first instinct was to deny it, of course. I told the detective this had to be some kind of mistake, that I'd never do anything like that, and that I couldn't believe she'd say something so horrible. I mean, this was my niece, a kid I'd practically helped raise since her dad passed. It just didn't make any sense. But here's the thing. The detective was looking at me like I was guilty right off the bat, like he'd already made up his mind. He said they'd already started an investigation and that things weren't looking good for me. Apparently, they'd talked to her mother too, and she was fully supportive of her daughter. Hearing that stung, but it also confused the hell out of me. I mean, why would my sister-in-law just back this up? Where was all this even coming from? At that point, I was panicking. It's one thing to have someone make accusations behind your back, but to hear it from a detective while you're sitting there in an interrogation room, it's a whole other level of fear. He kept pressing, asking if I had anything to hide, if there was anything I wanted to come clean about. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind, like this was all some sort of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, he asked if they could search my house. He made it sound like I didn't have a choice, so I agreed. I mean, I had nothing to hide, and at that point, I just wanted to do whatever I could to prove my innocence. But the idea of them going through my home, combing through everything like I was some sort of criminal, made me sick. After hours of questioning and waiting around, they finally let me go, but they didn't really clear anything up. The detective just told me to stay available, and that they'd be following up soon. I left that station in a daze, my mind spinning with questions I didn't have answers to. How did things come to this? Why would my niece say something so awful? And what the hell was my sister-in-law thinking, backing her up like that? When I got home, the reality hit me like a ton of bricks. This accusation could ruin my life, my job, my relationships, everything I'd worked for. It could all go down the drain because of a lie. I paced around my house, replaying the day's events over and over, trying to find some kind of logic to it all, but I kept coming up blank. My niece and I had never had issues. In fact, I thought we were close. I'd spent countless hours helping her, looking out for her, being there when she needed someone. It just didn't add up. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the detective's face, heard my niece's accusation echoing in my head. The sheer unfairness of it all gnawed at me, and I kept swinging between anger and disbelief. How could family betray you like this? Why would someone I'd trusted do something so cruel? I kept thinking there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding that could clear all this up. But deep down, a part of me was starting to fear the worst. My sister-in-law, her behavior, her willingness to back up this lie. Something about it felt too calculated, too purposeful. It wasn't just a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was starting to feel like an attack, a targeted attempt to ruin me. The next morning, I called in sick to work, too drained and distracted to even pretend I could get through a normal day. And as I sat there staring blankly at my phone, I realized I had a choice to make. I could try to push through, pretend this was all going to blow over, or I could start fighting back, digging into why they were doing this and exposing the truth. I didn't know what I'd uncover, but I was ready to find out. After that nightmare interrogation, I was left totally wrecked. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything other than what my niece had said about me. I was trying to make sense of it all, but every thought just led to more frustration and confusion. How could a kid I'd helped so much suddenly turn on me like this? And why would my sister-in-law, my late brother's wife, back her up on something so out of line? The worst part was that the police hadn't just brushed it off after she'd said it. They were taking her seriously, investigating me as if I'd actually done what she claimed. The entire situation felt insane. I was just sitting there in my own home, my life now under a cloud of suspicion. Everything around me felt different, like my whole house was tainted somehow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was going on here, like there was some missing piece to all this I couldn't see. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a kid saying something dumb. It felt planned, like there was a reason behind it. But what? Then out of nowhere, I got a call from the detective handling my case. He told me they needed to bring my niece in for another interview, this time without her mother present. That caught my attention. I didn't know why they'd separate them, but if the police were thinking something was fishy, that was a bit of a relief. It was like a tiny crack of hope that maybe this whole thing would get cleared up. I don't know what went on in that room during her second interview. All I know is that, a couple of hours later, I got a call that changed everything. The detective sounded different, like he was suddenly on my side. He told me that my niece had admitted to making the accusation up. I felt the air leave my lungs. She made it up? I mean, I wanted it to be false, obviously since it was a lie, but hearing it confirmed was just something else. I felt a strange mix of relief, anger, and honestly, just pure betrayal. I asked him what she'd said, why she would lie like that, but he said he couldn't give all the details over the phone. All he told me was that her mom, my sister-in-law, had pressured her into it. Hearing that, I can't describe it. There's this saying, blood is thicker than water, right? But in that moment, I felt like my own family had thrown me under the bus without a second thought. My sister-in-law had pushed her own daughter, her own kid, to lie and say that I'd done something unforgivable. For what? It didn't make any sense. When I met with the detective in person, he laid it all out. My niece had confessed that her mom told her to make the accusation because they needed money, and my sister-in-law thought this would be an easy way to blackmail me. The entire plan was to force me into a corner where I'd be so scared of the damage to my reputation that I'd pay up, stay quiet, and save my own skin. I sat there, stunned, while he explained it. Every word was like a stab in the back. I'd always known that my sister-in-law had struggled with finances after my brother died. That's why I'd stepped in so many times to help. Groceries, clothes for my niece, a little extra here and there to make sure they were okay. And she'd turned that against me, weaponized it to try to squeeze even more money out of me. The detective explained that, in her statement, my niece said she'd tried to push back at first. She knew it was wrong, she said, and she was scared to do it. But her mom had told her that they had no other options, that this was the only way. Imagine that, a 13-year-old being told by her own mother to do something so messed up because it was the only way. I was disgusted. I'd always thought I knew my sister-in-law. I mean, she's family. She married my brother, and when he passed, I felt like it was my duty to step in, to be there for them. But hearing how she manipulated her daughter into saying something that could destroy my entire life, I couldn't wrap my head around it. How desperate. How selfish do you have to be to put your kid through that? The detective asked if I had any idea she might be in such deep financial trouble. I told him honestly that she'd mentioned money issues a few times, but nothing ever that extreme. She was always vague about it, saying she might need a little help, that sort of thing. And yeah, I'd helped her out before, but I had no idea she'd gotten to the point where she'd turn on me like this. I couldn't sit still. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I kept thinking about all the times I'd trusted her, let her into my life, into my home. And now, knowing she was capable of this level of betrayal, it was unreal. I'd heard of people backstabbing each other for money, But this was my family. I never thought it'd happen to me, let alone from the people I'd been bending over backward to help. And then there was my niece. I didn't know what to feel about her anymore. Part of me felt sorry for her. She's just a kid, after all. But she'd still gone along with it. She'd still let those words leave her mouth, knowing full well what they could do to me. I couldn't stop picturing her face, the kid I'd helped raise, now forever associated with a lie that nearly shattered my life. The detective told me they'd follow up with my sister-in-law, but he couldn't guarantee anything. He said that even with my niece's confession, it'd be tricky proving the extent of my sister-in-law's involvement, especially if she tried to deny it. I was furious, but also powerless. The thought that she might somehow dodge the consequences for all this made me feel sick. I thanked the detective, shook his hand, and left the station. I walked home in a daze, still trying to process everything. I felt like I was split in two. On one hand, I was relieved that my name was cleared, that the lie had been exposed. On the other, I was filled with rage and sadness. This was my family. My own flesh and blood had tried to ruin me for money. When I got home, I just sat there in silence, replaying every moment over and over. The relief of being proven innocent was there, but it was buried under layers of anger, betrayal, and hurt. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that things would never be the same again. After finding out the truth from the detective, I barely kept myself together. The fact that my sister-in-law had gone so far as to use her own daughter to frame me, it's hard to explain what that feels like. The shock, the anger, the betrayal, it all just hit me in waves. But at the core of it, I knew what I had to do. I had to confront her. There was no way I could let this slide without hearing her pathetic excuse for why she thought any of this was even remotely okay. I didn't even bother calling. I drove straight to her place, my mind racing the whole way. I kept thinking of every moment over the past few years, every time I'd helped her out, every dollar I'd given to make sure they were okay. And she turned around and did this? My blood was boiling, and I didn't even know what I'd say when I saw her. All I knew was that I needed answers. When I got there, she answered the door looking surprised but not scared, which somehow made me angrier. Here she was, standing there like she hadn't just tried to ruin my life. I barely managed to hold myself back from exploding right then. Instead, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "We need to talk. Now." She tried to play it cool, giving me a fake smile and asking if I wanted to sit down, like this was some kind of normal conversation. I wasn't having it. "Why?" I asked, cutting to the chase. "Why would you do this? Why would you push your own daughter to make up something that serious?" At first she looked taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to be so direct. But then she recovered and gave me this tired, dramatic sigh. "Look," she said, "you don't understand how hard it's been. I'm a single mother, and things have been really rough since your brother passed. You have money, and I don't, and—" "Stop!" I interrupted. I didn't want to hear her excuses. "You tried to ruin my life. You told your daughter to accuse me of something disgusting. Do you have any idea what you were doing?" She crossed her arms and looked away, acting all defensive. "I didn't have a choice," she muttered, still not meeting my eyes. "You're well off, and we're struggling. I was desperate, okay? Desperate people do desperate things." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Desperate people do desperate things? That's her reasoning? "You thought dragging my name through the mud was an okay solution because you were low on cash?" I practically yelled. "I've helped you every single time you've asked, and this is how you repay me?" She rolled her eyes, which only set me off even more. "Oh, please. You act like you've done so much for us, but a few handouts here and there don't exactly solve all my problems. I needed real help." Real help? I couldn't stop myself from laughing at how absurd this was. "I've paid for groceries, clothes, school supplies, you name it. How much help were you planning to milk me for?" She stayed silent, but her jaw was clenched, and she finally looked up at me, clearly annoyed. "It's easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like, struggling day in and day out. I thought if I could just scare you a little, maybe you'd finally give us what we actually need." "Scare me?" The word echoed in my head. "You wanted to scare me into handing over money by having your daughter accuse me of something unforgivable. Do you understand how messed up that is? Or have you lost all sense of reality?" Her face hardened and she said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought you'd just pay up quietly, maybe feel bad enough to help us out long term. You have to understand, I didn't mean for it to get out of hand like this." Get out of hand. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. "You told your daughter to accuse me of a crime, a crime. Did you even consider what this would do to me, or what it would do to her?" She looked away again, not saying anything. It was like she'd built up this wall around herself where nothing could get through. She had no remorse, no sense of the destruction she'd nearly caused. She just kept muttering about how tough her life was, as if that somehow justified everything. I trusted you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I trusted you, and I trusted her. I've tried to be there for you both ever since my brother passed, and you used that against me. You weaponized your own daughter to try to blackmail me. Do you even hear yourself? She huffed, finally meeting my gaze with an indignant look. Fine, maybe it was a little extreme. But like I said, desperate times call for desperate measures. I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and disgust that I couldn't put into words. There's a difference between being desperate and being cruel, I said. And what you did was downright cruel. You tried to ruin my life for money, and you dragged your own kid into it. She didn't respond, just crossed her arms and stared at the floor like some petulant child who'd been scolded. I realized then that nothing I said was going to get through to her. She convinced herself that she was the victim, that her actions were somehow justified because she was struggling. You know what? I finally said, unable to hold back the bitterness. We're done. Don't call me for money. Don't ask me for help. You're on your own from here on out. That seemed to snap her out of her sulk. She looked up, eyes wide, and started protesting. But, but what about my daughter? She needs stability. She needs a mom who doesn't use her as a weapon, I shot back. And you clearly aren't that. You've made it pretty clear that you're willing to use her as a pawn if it suits you. So no, I won't be there to clean up your mess. She tried to guilt trip me after that, saying I was being too harsh, that my niece shouldn't suffer because of her mistakes. But I'd had enough. I told her I wasn't backing down, and I walked out. For the first time, I felt like I was actually breathing. The confrontation didn't give me any closure, though. If anything, I walked away feeling even more bitter. My sister-in-law had twisted things to make herself the victim, as if her struggles somehow justified everything she'd done. And the worst part was, she still didn't understand the damage she'd almost caused. I realized then that she didn't care about me or her daughter. She cared about getting what she wanted, no matter what it cost. When I got home, I felt drained. I thought confronting her would bring me some kind of peace, but all it did was make me realize how deeply she'd betrayed me. It was like a switch had flipped, and I finally saw her for who she really was, a manipulative, selfish person who would do anything to get her way. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. I couldn't trust her ever again. After that confrontation, I felt completely drained. I thought finally calling her out and cutting her off would bring me some kind of closure, maybe even peace. But if anything, I felt even more rattled. It was like I'd spent the whole time talking to a wall. She had no remorse, no real understanding of what she'd done. The woman honestly thought she was the victim in all this. When I got home, I just sat in silence for a long time, replaying everything in my mind. I tried to brush it off, tell myself that I was free of her, that I didn't owe her anything anymore. But every time I thought of her twisted excuses, that lack of remorse in her eyes, something boiled up in me again. She'd almost ruined my life, using her own daughter to try to manipulate and extort me, and she acted like it was nothing, like I was the one being unreasonable for not handing over cash. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the people I know, the people who might have heard about the accusations before they were cleared up. And even though the police had wrapped up the investigation with my name cleared, there was still this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that the damage was already done. People don't just forget things like that, even when the truth comes out. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just let this go, not after what she'd tried to pull. It wasn't enough to cut her off and move on with my life. I had to hold her accountable. If she was willing to go this far once, who's to say she wouldn't try it again with someone else? And the worst part was, she dragged her own daughter into this mess. That kid deserved better than a mother who would teach her to lie and scheme to get what she wanted. I called the detective who'd handled my case, told him I wanted to press charges against her. He seemed a bit surprised at first, probably thinking that since the accusation had been proven false, I'd want to just move on. But when I told him everything she'd said during our confrontation, the blackmail, the manipulation, the way she'd pressured her daughter, he understood. He asked if I was sure. He warned me that pressing charges wouldn't be easy, that it would be a drawn-out process, and I'd probably have to relive a lot of what had happened. I knew that, and yeah, it scared me, knowing I'd be diving back into the mess I'd just barely crawled out of. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't let fear keep me from doing the right thing. So I told him I was sure. Absolutely. This wasn't just for me, it was for my niece too. That kid needed a wake-up call, something to show her that actions have consequences, even when you're being pressured by the person you trust most. And I hoped, maybe, it'd be a wake-up call for my sister-in-law as well, though honestly, I doubted she'd ever truly get it. The next few weeks were tense. The police had to go over everything again, take my statement in more detail, even ask me about past times I'd helped her financially. I had to drag up memories I'd tried to forget, and it was tough, but I kept reminding myself why I was doing it. I had to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. I had to protect myself and anyone else who might have been her next target. Then, finally, the day came. The police showed up at her door and arrested her. I'll be honest, I didn't think I'd feel anything but relief, but the reality of it hit harder than I expected. This was still my family after all, my late brother's wife, my niece's mother, and now she was being taken away in handcuffs because of her own actions. But the thought of what she almost did to me, how close she'd come to wrecking my life, kept me grounded. This was on her. A few people heard about the arrest, of course. Family talk spreads like wildfire. I got calls from relatives asking what happened, telling me I was out of line, saying I should have just let it go. But I explained everything, from the accusation to the blackmail. And for the most part, people started to see things my way. Some still thought I was harsh, but others were shocked, especially when they realized my sister-in-law had used her own daughter to try and get to me. One relative actually told me, "You're doing the right thing. People need to learn there are consequences." That gave me some comfort, knowing at least a few people understood where I was coming from. The day after her arrest, I found myself thinking about my niece. I knew CPS would be involved now, that she'd probably be placed somewhere temporarily. Part of me felt responsible for her, guilty even, but then I remembered she'd been manipulated too. I couldn't protect her from the consequences of her actions, but maybe this would be her chance to see things clearly, to understand that her mother's actions weren't okay, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, it still stung. I had cared for that kid, treated her like my own, and she'd gone along with her mom's scheme without any thought for what it would do to me. It's not something you just get over. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding, trying to get back to some kind of normalcy. But the whole experience had left its mark. I was more cautious now, more guarded. Family didn't mean the same thing it used to. I'd learned the hard way that loyalty can be one-sided, and people you trust can turn on you for reasons you'll never understand. When I look back on that decision to press charges, there's no regret. I did what I had to do. I protected myself, and maybe in a way, I helped my niece too. I hope one day she'll realize that this was all because her mother took advantage of both of us. I hope it's a lesson she'll never forget. In the days after my sister-in-law's arrest, I felt like I was in this weird in-between place. Part relief, part regret, and a whole lot of anger that hadn't really gone anywhere. My family was pretty divided over what had happened. Some people thought I was completely in the right, and others thought I'd gone too far pressing charges against her, that I should have just let it slide and moved on. It was funny in a way. Everyone had an opinion, but no one really understood what I'd been through. I tried not to let it bother me. At the end of the day, I knew why I'd done it. I couldn't let what she did go unpunished, not when she'd come so close to destroying my life. And honestly, I hoped it would teach my niece a lesson too. But even knowing that, it didn't make things easier. My family, the people I thought I could count on, felt like strangers now. Going back to work was strange. For a while, I felt like I had this label stuck to me, like everyone could see what I'd been through even if they didn't know the details. I know it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake it. I was hyper aware of every interaction, wondering if people were thinking things or whispering behind my back. My boss and a few close friends knew what happened, and they were supportive, which helped, but it still felt like this heavy cloud was hanging over me. Every day, I'd replay everything in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Could I have prevented this? Should I have been more cautious with my sister-in-law? Maybe not been so trusting? It's weird. Up until this mess, I'd always believed in being generous, especially with family. But now I couldn't help but question all of it. Had I been naive? Too willing to help? I'd always seen myself as a good guy, but I started to realize that sometimes being the good guy just makes you an easy target. About a week after the arrest, I got a call from a family friend who'd heard bits and pieces of what went down. She told me that my niece was staying in a temporary foster home, and I felt a pang of guilt I couldn't ignore. I knew she'd been manipulated, that her mom had put her in an impossible position, but that didn't erase the fact that she'd gone along with it. It's hard to look past that. Still, hearing that she was alone in a foster home hit me. No kid should have to go through that, even if they were part of something so messed up. Part of me wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of support. Maybe get in touch with her through CPS or see if there was a way I could check in. But every time I thought about it, I just felt this wall of anger go up again. I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Maybe one day, but right then, the wounds were too fresh. And besides, I wasn't even sure what good it would do. She needed time to process everything, to understand the consequences of her actions, and I needed time to heal. Update. It had been a few months since everything had gone down with my sister-in-law, and for the first time in a while, I was beginning to feel like things were stabilizing. I'd put a lot of distance between myself and the whole mess, and while I still felt betrayed, I was getting better at managing it, at not letting it control my every thought. Life was finally starting to feel normal again, or at least as normal as it could after something like that. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't pick up. I'd been dodging random numbers for a while, figuring they were either telemarketers or family members trying to stir things up. But something about this one made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Hello, is this my name?" "Yeah," I replied, still a bit guarded. "Who's this?" "This is Sarah from Child Protective Services. We have your niece in our care and wanted to speak with you about a potential option." Hearing that, I felt a cold shock hit me, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. She went on, explaining that my niece had been in temporary foster care since my sister-in-law's arrest. Apparently, they'd reached out to other family members, but either they hadn't met the criteria or weren't interested in taking her in. So here they were, giving me a call to see if I would consider temporary custody. I I don't know, I stammered, feeling a rush of emotions that I wasn't ready to face. "I'm not sure I'm the best option." Sarah was patient, letting me process everything. She explained that my niece's case was complicated, that she'd been through a lot with her mom, and that her environment hadn't exactly set her up for success. She sounded understanding, even sympathetic, like she knew how loaded this was for me. And maybe she did. She'd probably handled cases like this before. "Look," she said after a moment, "I'm not saying you have to decide right now. This is a difficult situation, and I understand there's been a lot of conflict. But as a family member, you'd have a chance to provide some stability for her, even if it's just temporary." I told her I'd think about it, and we agreed to talk again in a couple of days. When I hung up, I just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to wrap my head around it all. The idea of taking her in felt overwhelming. Part of me wanted to help her. She was just a kid, and she'd been through a mess of her own. But another part of me couldn't shake the hurt and betrayal of what she'd done, even if her mom had pressured her into it. The next couple of days were a whirlwind. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't really sleep either. The decision hung over me like a weight, making everything else feel insignificant. I kept going back and forth, trying to weigh the options. On one hand, she was still my niece. Despite everything that had happened, I'd watched her grow up. I remembered birthdays, holidays, the times I'd brought over gifts and groceries, knowing her mom was struggling to make ends meet. I'd cared about her as if she were my own daughter, and I couldn't deny that part of me still wanted to protect her, to make sure she had a shot at a decent life. I tried to convince myself that maybe, in the right environment, she'd have a chance to grow beyond what her mom had done. But on the other hand, I couldn't forget what she'd done. The accusation, the investigation, the sleepless nights and constant anxiety, the feeling of being on trial in my own life, the way she'd looked at me with that cold, rehearsed gaze, saying things that had nearly destroyed me. It was hard to see her as an innocent kid after that, no matter how much I told myself she'd been manipulated. Part of me knew she was just a pawn, that she'd done what she was told, but that didn't erase the damage. My friends had mixed opinions. Some told me it wasn't worth reopening that wound, that it would be too painful, too risky to bring her into my life after what had happened. Others said maybe it was an opportunity to make a difference, that if I took her in, I could be the positive influence she needed to turn things around. But none of them knew what it felt like to have your whole life threatened by someone you thought you could trust. None of them had been through that level of betrayal. Finally, I agreed to meet with her. CPS arranged a supervised visit at their office, and I showed up, nervous and unsure of what to expect. When I walked in, she was sitting there, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and for a second I saw a flash of fear, maybe even guilt. She mumbled a, "Hi," barely looking at me. I sat across from her, unsure what to say. She looked different, more closed off, almost guarded. It was like she'd built up walls around herself, walls I wasn't sure I could break through. But then, I realized I was doing the same thing. I was sitting there, my guard up, every instinct telling me to protect myself. I cleared my throat, trying to start the conversation. "How are you holding up?" It was all I could think to say. She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. It's okay, I guess. Different. There was a pause, and then she added, barely a whisper, I'm sorry. Hearing those words, I felt something tighten in my chest. I'd been waiting for an apology, hoping she'd own up to what had happened, but now that she'd said it, it felt hollow. Or maybe it was me that was hollow. I couldn't tell anymore. We sat there in silence, both of us awkward, unsure. When the visit ended, CPS asked if I'd come to a decision. I told them I needed a little more time, but on the drive home, I realized I already knew my answer. I wanted to help her, I really did, but I also knew that having her in my life under my roof would be a constant reminder of everything I'd been through. I'd always wonder if I could trust her, if she was really sorry or just doing what she thought I wanted to hear, and that's no way to build a home. So a few days later, I called Sarah back and told her my decision. I wouldn't be taking her in. It wasn't an easy choice, and it definitely wasn't the one I'd imagined I'd ever have to make. But after everything, I needed to protect myself too. I hoped maybe that she'd find a place where she could learn from what had happened, where she could start fresh without the weight of her mom's mistakes hanging over her. It's hard to say goodbye to family, but sometimes you have to let go to move forward.